So for the next 15 or so minutes, I'll work to answer these three questions, and out of respect for your time, I won't read from my slides. Now, clarifying what biodesign is, I feel like is particularly important at a place like Dutch Design Week, and especially now because there really is a explosion of bio-themed content. Sometimes it's called biomimicry, sometimes it's just called biofabrication or biophilic design. So one of the first things I think it's important to do is make a kind of clearer definition. And for me, biodesign, and I hope that more will adopt this, can be really divided into three categories: with, for, or about biology. And to help explain all this, I'll give an example of each one. First, with biology. So there's a security concern that's growing now that we have affordable drones. Okay, so imagine a place like an airport where an airplane could be interfered with one of these, or many of these, taking off or landing. Many solutions have been sort of considered for this problem, from lasers and nets to building walls to using electromagnetic pulses. But a more interesting bio-based solution comes from a firm in Den Haag, where it's called Guard from Above, and they train birds of prey, hawks and eagles, to, over the course of a year, consider drones as like a food source. And so what that looks like in action, from the perspective of a drone that's going into a space that it doesn't belong. Now, the meeting of technology and biology does not have to be so violent, but there's something oddly satisfying about seeing that and knowing, as you do when you are at the airport and let's say you see a dog that's there to sniff for drugs or bombs, that the little nose on that thing is more advanced and more reliable, more effective, and more affordable than our most cutting-edge sensory technology. So moving on to for biology. A work like this I would categorize that way. This is the now well-known Bosco Verticale that's in Milan by Studio Stefano Borri. Borri is notably one of the ambassadors for Dutch Design Week this year. So this is, in some ways, if I were to oversimplify it, a kind of very elaborately designed piece of architecture that's like a potted plant. It allows for taking advantage of the small footprint of a skyscraper to introduce into an urban space that lacks biomaterials or bioprocesses, a density of trees and shrubs, which then, of course, give a foothold to other species, from microbes to birds and insects. And this approach has gotten very popular very fast. It is something of a fad, which, of course, we should be skeptical about. But I think this notion of using technology like our skyscrapers to do something more with biology, to let it flourish, to give it a platform, is a valid approach, and it's one that I categorize as for biology. And then finally, third, about biology. So this category is rather broad, and about biology could be work that is speculative, so trying to envision a future that's characterized by synthetic biology. Maybe a lot of the work from Next Nature, I would say, would fit into this group, but also design of communicating information, so like academic work that strives to make clear things like how we all live in an indoor microbiome, that around us there are literally trillions of microbes. Some of them are beneficial, many of them are neutral, a few of them might be pathogenic. So an organization like the producers of this video, they're called the BioB Center, that's Biology in the Built Environment Center, do work to try to map out what all of those populations of organisms look like in spaces like this one, like a shop, a bedroom, an office, with the hope that over time, if we know enough about what likes to live where, we can maybe produce interiors or have an architectural strategy around making spaces probiotic. And this is just a sort of illustration of how ubiquitous all this life is around us. So those three examples, along with 71 others, are profiled in this book that I wrote, Biodesign. The first edition of it came out in 2013, and the new edition of it, that's expanded, just came out last year. The way that I got interested in this whole field goes back to an interest in really good food. So this is about 10 or 11 years ago, I really got semi-obsessed with trying to make the best bread, which required, I learned, this sort of very complex choreography of materials, flour, water, time, heat, temperature, and of course yeast. And, and with yeast, it has this complex relationship with the bacteria as well, if you make something like sourdough. So over time, learning about this and getting to a point where I had to think like the yeast or try to understand empathetically what it wanted, really kind of led me down this road of thinking, what else in the biosphere, what else have we not discovered or really looked at as a potential collaborator is still out there to be discovered, and what can design do for it? Also foundational for me has been this book, Biomimicry. It's still relevant. It is a bit dated. It came out in 1997, and it looks at how biological processes and interdependencies can be appreciated as engineering solutions, which then can be mimicked in mechanical or digital technologies to make them more effective and more efficient. And then going a step further, to me, it was very seminal. This book, Cradle to Cradle, first released in 2003, makes the case for how the whole economy and how systems of, how systems of manufacturing and building can be made like ecosystems so that waste is eliminated and everything that goes into each of those systems can safely either re-enter the environment or re-enter the technosphere, or re-enter the recycling and renewal system. When I read this, I remember thinking, this is so persuasive and absolutely fantastic. This is what has to happen, or else the world is going to be in such a bad place. And of course, that didn't happen. This wasn't widely embraced. It is, I would say, beginning to get more sort of notice, and now it's sort of called something else. It's basically the same idea, but the circular economy is what we call today this sort of approach. So for me, those were the beginnings, and then I took the book and the ideas within it and made exhibitions wherever I was allowed to. One of the first was in Rotterdam at the New Institute. Then subsequently, over the course of the next few years, I did shows in Bursa, Turkey, biomaterials, and then somewhat more recently at the Rhode Island School of Design in collaboration with the Nature Lab. And then at around the time I was organizing this, it became sort of apparent that there was much growing interest in bioprocessing and biodesign and making those into exhibitions. And then these programs and books and conferences and awards really started to pick up and appear over the next year. So there's a new MA, a Master's in Biodesign at Central St. Martin's in London. There's the Biofabricate conference that's now, I think, on its 5th or 6th iteration that's about to open in London. Of course, the BioArt and Design Award that's here in the Netherlands, the Biodesign Challenge in New York, and so on. And some of those activities, of course, led to exhibitions at major museums and places like in Milan at the Triennale, the exhibition Broken Nature by Paolo Antonelli brought together more than 100 works, varying approaches, also included artworks, bioartworks. In Paris at the Centre Pompidou, this show, Life's Factory, almost 60 different projects, presented it in an aesthetic that I have some questions about, this kind of dark and somewhat mysterious and maybe dangerous sort of looking place, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. At the V&A Museum in London, which focused on fashion and how natural materials are either inspirational or can be integrated into those processes of making. And then the show, which I think is still up now at the Cooper Hewitt in New York, that's the National Design Museum in the US, presents over 60 works in this very clear format, and it's organized in a way that I really appreciate by the intention of the project or the intention of the designer in these many categories. And then sandwiched between all of this new contemporary work, they present works from their, or treasures I would say, from their collection that somewhat relate to the same themes. Notably, that show at the Cooper Hewitt has a sister show that's open now in the Netherlands at the Cube Museum, which, if I understand right, is the first dedicated design museum in the south of the Netherlands. And it's on right now with many of the same projects or same participants as the show in New York. And then, of course, it brings us to where we are now. So this work, the Growing Pavilion by the Stichting New Helden, a Foundation New Heroes, in collaboration with, I think, Studio Klarenbeek, is just yet another example, along with so much of the content at Dutch Design Week, of how this is of intense interest and hopefully pointing to a very different future of how we build and make things. So now I want to present 3 different ways that there are obstacles to that future. The first is economic, the second is aesthetics, and the third is fear. I think that waiting any longer for companies, for governments to sort of do the right thing has really passed, and that it's necessary to really harness the maybe darker parts of capitalism to enable some brighter future. And I think that one of the ways to do that is to think of biodiversity and of ecosystems as capital assets, of places that actually create value, create money for the community. And this is some of the ways that that kind of thinking is described, or ammunition for how to make such an argument, with biodiversity as a resiliency engine. Then the aesthetics. So we can agree maybe, or many people would, that this kind of architecture, which is very, very old, is beautiful. This is a root bridge in northeastern India. Some of these examples are more than 400 years old. And then a more contemporary vision of what it might be like to live with biology sort of integrated in a very literal and a very intimate way. It's this vision of the Fab Tree Hab by Terraform 1 that's also was presented with a business plan, but there were, not surprisingly really, no takers in terms of investors. And I think the aesthetics of this is very notable. So this is an architecture with which a designer needs to surrender control. And why is that so difficult? I think in part because of the legacy of modernism, and particularly the very sterile, geometric, and precise aesthetic of mid-century modernism, as evidenced by a work like this, the Seagram Building by Mies van der Rohe, considered by many historians to be the absolutely most fantastic and influential building of the 20th century. And all that exactness, all of this creation of these black cubes or white cube spaces can be argued as part of a push towards a reduction of forms, of more precision or the machine aesthetic. And maybe part of that is valid, but I think that a large part of why it is appealing, or it was appealing, at least for its time, is that we have this deep-rooted fear of the biological, this deep-rooted fear of germs and what it is that makes us sick, what it is that we can't control or we can't see. What you're seeing is a picture of people that are suffering from the Spanish flu in the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1918. That was a pandemic that killed 50 million people, probably more because it was underreported by some of the European powers. But since that time, we have largely gotten control over these plagues, right? They still exist, of course, and there still could be a future that is characterized by their danger, but we've gone with medical science so far, so fast, that I think our thinking about space and about sickness and about biology that's invisible has still to catch up a lot. When we talk about bacteria, when we talk about synthetic biology or using microbes in design, people almost always immediately associate the microorganism with the pathogenic, which of course is not always the case. And as a result, we also, for a very long time now, to our detriment, have over-sanitized spaces. We've overused cleaning products that are toxic. We've given rise to superorganisms that resist all these things and can get us even sicker. And yet there's hope. So also through medical science, and sometimes now through progress through design, largely design about biology, we're starting to appreciate the microbiome in the human and in, of course, the interior spaces. This is just a glimpse at the complexity of the skin microbiome, apart from all of that lives within us. If this interests you, if you want to have an inspirational sort of feast of what is out there in the world of biology today, what we now know, and how it could be possibly used for design, if you think in those terms, this is a great book that I can recommend. It highlights the vast number and sort of character of the complex interdependencies that happen between different species, including human and non-human. So also on the topic of fear, I think one of the ways to overcome that obstacle is through design projects that make sense visually, but that also are like a hand-holding or a way to sort of introduce the idea of biology in the interaction or in the home in a way that's non-threatening. So this is a moss table wherein the small vessels take advantage of the metabolisms that, or the exchange that happens in organic materials and the metabolism between the mosses and the microbes within, which release a small stream of electrons that can be harnessed to power really small devices. Again, moss is it's something that we see outside. We know that we can touch it. We know it's not dangerous. And then a project that was featured in Dutch Design Week, I think it was 6 years ago, by Lieske Schrader. It's called the Snail Poop Machine. And for this, she fed a number of snails colored paper and then collected their poop and then added to it these sort of connective compounds that were all organic to make these sort of tiles and other decorative small objects as an illustration of what could be possible. And I look to something like this and I appreciate how, when I've seen this in an exhibition, a 5-year-old and an 89-year-old can easily sort of get it, and they laugh, right, because it has a bit of humor in it. But also there's this notion that it is, like the moss, something that's familiar. We see it in everyday life. It's slow-moving. It doesn't seem threatening. If you go to France, you can eat them. So I think for every project like that, we move maybe a step closer or a step away from the fear that we have been socialized to have about these organisms. And finally, so this new book that I have, it's not here today, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to give you some contact information later, and I can arrange for one to have be shipped to you. If you're a student and you would like to have some free advice on how to get into the field of biodesign, how to approach a scientist, what resources you might want to look at, I invite you to this free download of a chapter from the book. And I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to discussion later.